We shall never surrender.
Churchill is a 1 to 3 player game where each player takes the role of one of the big three supreme Allied leaders in World War II: Roosevelt, Stalin, and of course, Winston Churchill. The game has players competing against each other for victory points, but also requires each player to cooperate with the others. A player that accumulates an inordinate amount of victory points may lose the game by driving the other two powers into an alliance against him. To win, therefore, the player must obtain the highest number of victory points and win by a close margin. Thus, the victory conditions reflect the tensions and struggles existing within the alliance, as the powers prosecute the war to its conclusion and make efforts at shaping the post-war world. The game includes one 22-inch by 34-inch mounted map board. The map board is divided into two major displays. The conference display is where most of the interaction between the players will take place. It is represented by a circular conference table similar to the ones used in the actual Allied conferences. In the middle of the display is the center of the table space, or zero space. Radiating from the center are tracks for each of the sides with their respective leader chairs at the end of the tracks. The military display is divided into the European and Pacific theaters. Germany is in the center of the European theater, while Japan is in the center of the Pacific theater. A number of front tracks divided into spaces spiral into the Axis powers. Front markers represent the current position of Allied forces on a particular front. During the war phase, all front markers must attempt to advance into the next space along the track, which is called the entry space. If one or more fronts enter an Axis power space, that Axis power surrenders. Adjacent to the front track spaces are spaces for countries and colonies, where the powers may place their clandestine network and political alignment markers. Clandestine networks represent the support by a side to occupied resistance movements. Political alignment markers represent governments in exile sponsored by each of the Allied powers. In the atomic bomb status track, the United States and Great Britain advanced their research marker to deploy the bomb for its use against Japan, while the Soviets advanced their Manhattan Spy Ring marker in their efforts to steal atomic bomb technology. There is also a scoring track to keep tally of the victory points won by each of the sides. Offensive support and naval support markers are used to increase the strength of the fronts when attempting to advance along their respective tracks. Issue markers are kept on the conference display until they are selected during the agenda segment and placed in the center of the table space. During the game, each of the powers also receive production markers. These are converted into offensive support and naval support markers, or can be used to convert political military issues into political alignment and clandestine network markers. There are 4 leader cards, one for Churchill, Stalin, Roosevelt, and if Roosevelt dies, one for Harry Truman. Each leader has special abilities, penalties for use, and in the card is specified the side's national characteristic. Each side also has 21 staff cards. Each card represents a historical character with a value and text that describes his special abilities or penalties for the card's use. Staff cards are played during conferences to nominate an issue as well as to advance or debate an issue. There are 30 conference cards. Conference cards are revealed at the start of each conference, and they contain instructions that pertain to each of the sides, as well as military events and events affecting clandestine networks and political alignment in countries and colonies. The rulebook is 36 pages long, although the actual rules needed to play the game cover 17 pages. One of the most innovative aspects of this game is the way that victory is defined. The game uses a victory point schedule to determine the number of victory points gained by advancing fronts, the surrender of Axis powers, and atomic bomb research. Because the game involves the interactions between competing members of an alliance, obtaining the highest number of victory points does not always translate in winning the game. The game ends after the 10th conference or during any conference if both Axis powers have surrendered. There are 3 endgame situations. In the first situation, if both Axis powers have surrendered and the difference between the highest victory point score and the lowest victory point score is 15 or less, then the player with the most victory points wins. In the second situation, if both Axis powers have surrendered and the difference between the highest victory point score and lowest victory point score is greater than 15, a die is rolled. The die result, which will be 1 to 6, is added to 15 to obtain what we call the new value, which will be somewhere between 16 and 21. If the difference between the high score and the low score is equal or less than the new value, the player with the high score wins. But if the difference between the high score and low score is greater than this new value, the player with the second highest score wins. And there is a third and last endgame situation. If at the end of the last conference at least one Axis power has not surrendered, then each player rolls 1 die and modifies his score as follows. The highest scoring player subtracts the die roll from his score. The second highest scorer subtracts half of the die roll value rounded up from his score. And the lowest scorer adds the die roll value to his score. The player with the highest modified score wins the game. So, as you can see, this game places you in a completely different mindset than other purely competitive games. Players must work towards their nation's particular goals, but within the framework of an alliance, and win on the basis of victory points by a close margin. The campaign scenario consists of 10 conferences. There are also 2 shorter scenarios included, a training scenario comprising 3 conferences and a tournament scenario composed of the last 5 conferences during the war. We will play the extended example of play contained in the rulebook. This is an example of the first conference, which is conference number 8, of the 3-conference training scenario. From the conference deck, we pull the cards for conferences 8, 9, and 10. Now we set up the units and markers on the map. Let's take a look first at the situation in the European theater. The Soviet forces are currently in Prussia with their sights into advancing into East Germany. We place the Soviet front marker there. The Soviets have clandestine networks in all but 2 of the countries in the Eastern Front. They have political alignment markers in Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, and the Baltic states. And the British have clandestine networks in Greece and Poland. Meanwhile, in the Western theater, the Allies have advanced into the Rhineland and are about to enter West Germany. European Theater Command is in the hands of the Americans, who have 2 clandestine and 2 political alignment markers in France and Czechoslovakia. The British have 2 clandestine and political alignment markers in the Netherlands and Belgium. The Allies also have 5 naval support markers in the Western theater box. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean theater, the Allied advance is currently in central Italy. The British have 2 clandestine and 2 political alignment markers in the Middle East and Persia. And there are 3 naval support markers for this theater. Now let's take a look at the starting situation in the Pacific theater. In the Central Pacific, the Allied advance is currently in the Mariana Islands. And the Allies have 3 naval support markers allocated to this specific theater. In the Southwest Pacific, the Allies are currently at Vogelkop, New Guinea. And 3 naval support markers are allocated to this theater. In the China-Burma-India theater, the Allied advance is currently in the starting box. The U.S. has clandestine networks in all colonies except Malaya, with political alignment markers in Siam and Cambodia, Laos. And finally, 1 naval support marker is allocated to this theater. In the Far East theater, the Soviet advance is currently at Nomonhan. And the Pacific Theater Command is currently under the control of the United States. We place the global issue markers in the neutral position. We place the leader blocks in their respective spaces near the active band, and we place the leader markers on their active sides. Now we place all conference issues markers, except the one for the second front, in their respective spaces on the board. And we place alignment cylinders to be used to keep track of victory points for each of the sides on the victory point track. Each side starts the game with their respective leader and a deck of 21 staff cards. At the beginning of the conference phase, a set number of production markers is given to each of the sides. 6 for the United States, 4 for the British, and 3 production markers for the Soviet Union. And at the beginning of the game, the Germans have 6 reserve armies. There's no German Navy in this scenario. It is assumed to be a force that has not enough strength to be represented in the game. The Japanese begin with 4 reserve armies and 2 Imperial Japanese Navy reserve units. Now we begin the game with the conference phase, and there are 3 segments in the conference phase: the agenda segment, the meeting segment, and the decision segment. We start with the agenda segment. We reveal the top conference card and we will implement its instructions. And we see that the conference card has instructions which are color-coded. The green instructions pertain to the British, the red to the Soviets, the blue to the Americans, the gray refer to military events, and the white instructions refer to events relating to clandestine networks and political alignment. So we start with the British event or instructions. Churchill, Mountbatten, and Cairo. The British have to use one production marker to place an offensive support marker in the China-Burma-India theater. The British begin the conference with 4 production markers, so we will place one as a reminder in the China-Burma-India theater box, and this will serve as a reminder when the decision segment comes. And we have to allocate production for the British, that they have to convert that production marker into an offensive support marker to be placed in that theater. Now we go to the Soviet instruction northern flank. If there are less than 3 naval support markers in the Arctic theater, there is only one, so that applies. We have U-boats, and we roll 1d6 on a 1 through 3. The Murmansk convoy arrives, and the Soviets receive 1 production marker. 4 through 6, no convoy. The roll is a 5, so the Soviets receive no additional production on account of the Murmansk convoy. Now the American instruction, Roosevelt stays in Washington, and Roosevelt cannot be used during this conference to advance an issue. He can still be used to debate an issue. So Roosevelt is active, he just can't advance an issue, so we place this marker as a reminder. He may still debate issues. Next instruction, Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy sorties in the Southwest Pacific Theater, and also 1 Japanese Reserve Army is placed in that theater. So as a reminder, we take 1 Imperial Japanese Navy unit and place it in the Southwest Pacific Theater box next to the naval support marker, and we place 1 Japanese army in the entry space for the Southwest Pacific Theater front, which is the Philippines. The last instruction, partisan dispute. We roll 1d6 on a 1 to 3. We roll that number of times on the Pol-Mil table, political military table, and remove all clandestine networks from those locations. On a 4 through 6, no effect. And the roll is a 6, so there is no effect. If the die result would have been 1, 2, or 3, then we would have rolled that number of times on the political military table to see from which countries or colonies we would remove clandestine network markers. Now, after shuffling their respective staff decks, each of the players deals themselves 7 staff cards. Each of the players now add to their 7 staff card hand their respective leader card. Let's take a look at each of the players' hands. Let's take a look at the British hand. Sir Winston Churchill. Menzies, strength of 1. Beaverbrook. Cunningham, strength of 2. Not very impressive. Portal, 1. Dudley Pound, another 1. So these are not the kind of staff cards that the British would probably want. But Attlee is pretty strong unless Churchill is active. And Bevan is a strong leader unless advancing a political military issue on the Soviet track, where he loses 1 strength. Now let's see the Soviet hand. Stalin is a very interesting character here. He may go paranoid, and that could have a detrimental effect for the remainder of the conference if that happens. And when you see the other Soviet characters and their staff, they tend to have low strength numbers because they were under a lot of pressure by their own leader. And some have interesting effects like Merkulov, who may send the next Soviet staff member to be played to the Gulag. Here we have Budyonny with a strength of 5. Unless Stalin is active, then that goes down to 3. Molotov, also a strength of 5, strong staff member. Malenkov, not very strong unless advancing a strategic material issue. And here we have Kuznetsov. When you play his card, naval marker goes to the Arctic theater box. And finally, Georgy Shukov, he's the chief of staff. And that's why he has the star here. Instead of a printed strength number, every time you play a chief of staff card like Shukov's, you roll 1d6 and the result will be his strength. So that is the Soviet hand. Now let's see the American hand. We have Roosevelt, and he has to roll for health every time his card is used, and he may even die. But let's see the other characters we have here. Crowley, 2 strength. Embrick, 1 strength, not very impressive. Donovan is a 2 strength, but if advancing a political military issue, it goes up to 5. Frank Walker, 2 strength. And if Roosevelt is active in the conference, it goes up to 4. Morgenthau, 4 strength and 5 strength if he's advancing a global issue. Harriman, strength of 4, and he may get a +1. And finally, Harry Hopkins, strength of 5. And apparently he's not very friendly with Truman. His strength goes down to 2 if Truman is the president. So that's the American hand. Now continuing with the agenda segment, each side selects 1 staff card to be played. And now we simultaneously reveal the card selected by each side. The staff member with the highest strength will be able to select 1 issue from the conference issues and place it in the center of the table and move that issue towards his chair, a number of spaces equal to the difference between his strength and the lowest opposing strength. So we see that Beaverbrook has a strength of 3, Crowley and Vosnesensky strengths of 2, and Beaverbrook, his strength actually increases by 1 because of the British national characteristic. As shown here in Churchill's leader card, the British have a national characteristic called Imperial Staff. Any staff card played during an agenda segment earns the British a +1 to that staff member's strength. In the agenda segment, the only staff card value modification allowed is the +1 for the British national characteristic. In this case, Beaverbrook has an attribute that increases his strength by 2 if Churchill is active in the conference, and Churchill is active. However, this attribute is not in effect during the agenda segment, and Beaverbrook's strength is therefore 4. That is 3 for his printed strength, +1 for the British national characteristic. Beaverbrook's rating actually would be a 4, and he would beat Crowley's 2 as well as Vosnesensky's 2. So the winner of the agenda segment is the United Kingdom. The British select 1 issue from the conference issues display, and they will select this 2/2 political military issue. The number to the left represents the number of political alignment markers that this issue creates, and the number to the right, the number of clandestine networks. Since the British selected this issue, we place it in the center of the table, and we move it a number of spaces towards the British chair, equal to the difference between the British strength 4 and the lowest opposing strength of 2. So the difference is 2. So we move it 2 spaces, and it is now in the number 2 British box. So the British won the agenda. They already placed an issue and moved it towards their track. Now, the player to the left of the player that won the agenda, the Soviets, now have to select 2 issues and place them in the center of the table. The Soviets select a U.S. production issue and another political military issue, the 1/3. And they are placed in the center of the table. Now the Americans select two issues. The Americans want the Soviets to get more involved against Japan, so they select the USSR declares war on Japan issue, as well as a Soviet-directed offensive issue. And they are placed in the center of the table. And now the British select two issues. The British want to have control of the European theater of command, so they take the European theater leadership issue as well as the global issue marker. And they go to the center of the table. And we place the three staff cards played in the agenda segment in the discard pile. Now we go to the meeting segment. The British won the agenda segment, so the meeting segment commences with the side immediately to the left, the Soviets, and the Soviets select a staff card to advance an issue. So the Soviets will play this card, Vsevolod Merkulov, the People's Commissar of State Security. He has a strength of 1, which is really weak, but if used to advance a political military issue, the strength goes up to 2. And he also has a Gulag effect. If we play his card during the next turn, after playing or discarding another Soviet staff card, we have to roll 1d6, and on a result of 1, that staff member is arrested and goes to the Gulag. So Merkulov is played, and the political military issue is moved 2 spaces and is now in the number 2 box of the Soviet track. Now the Americans have a chance to debate that issue, and they decide not to. And the British now may debate the issue, and they also decline debating the issue. So the issue marker stays for now in the number 2 Soviet track box, and Merkulov's card goes to the discard pile. And now it's the Americans' turn, and they select General Stanley Enbrick, chairman of the Joint Strategic Survey Committee. He has a strength of 1, but his strength increases by 2 if used to advance a directed offensive issue. So his card is played to advance the Soviet directed offensive issue, which is moved 3 spaces to the number 3 box on the US track. Now the British may debate the issue, but they decline. The Soviets will debate. And the Soviets decide to send Semyon Budyonny, the cavalry inspector of the Red Army. He has a printed strength of 5, which is decreased by 2 if Stalin is active in the conference, which he is, and that would reduce his strength to 3. But his strength would be increased by 1 because of the Soviet national characteristic in this game, which is called Niet. And that is, whenever a Soviet staff member will debate an issue, his strength is increased by 1. So Budyonny's net strength is 4. And by debating the issue, Budyonny causes that the issue marker be moved 4 spaces, and it is now in the number 1 box of the USSR track. And now, before discarding Budyonny, the Gulag effect of Merkulov kicks in. We have to roll 1d6, and on a result of 1, Budyonny would be removed permanently from the game because it is assumed that he would be arrested and sent to the Gulag. So we roll 1d6. And luckily for Budyonny, the roll is a 3, so he's not arrested for now. So we place Embrick in the discard pile as well as Budyonny. But because the Soviets played a staff card to debate an issue, they have an option in the next turn to pass. And they must either play a staff card or pass. And whatever happens, we remove that pass marker. So they only have a chance to pass immediately after they debate an issue. Now we move on to the British turn. And the British play Sir Andrew Cunningham, the first Sea Lord. He has an attribute that if he is used to advance the European leadership change, his strength goes up by 2 to 4. So Cunningham's card is played and the European theater leadership is moved to the British number 4 box. The Russians decline debating the issue, and so do the Americans. And Cunningham's card is placed in the discard pile. Now it's the Soviets' turn to play a card, but in order to preserve cards for now, they decide to pass, so we remove the pass marker. Now it's the Americans' turn. And the Americans will play William Donovan of the Office of Strategic Services. He has a strength of 2, but if used to advance a political military issue, his strength is 5. So he will advance this political military issue from the number 2 box of the Soviet track to the number 3 box of the US track. And neither the British nor the Soviets will debate the issue. And Donovan's card goes to the discard pile. Now we go to the British turn. And the British decide to play Sir Charles Portal. He has a strength of 1, which is really weak, but if used to advance an issue on the US track, his strength increases by 2, and there is an issue on the US track, which is the 1/3 Paul Mill issue. So he advances that issue 3 spaces back to the center of the table. Now the Soviets may debate the issue and they decline. The Americans, on the other hand, will debate the issue. They select Frank Walker's card, but not to play this card to debate the issue, but to discard the card in order for the Americans to play their leader card, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Remember that as per the conference card, Roosevelt could not advance an issue, but he can certainly debate one. So Roosevelt is used to debate this issue. So Roosevelt's card is played to debate the issue, and the political military issue marker reaches Roosevelt's chair. The Americans have captured this issue. Note that the attribute for Roosevelt doesn't apply because his card was not played on a global issue. However, because his card was used, we have to roll to see if Roosevelt survives this health check. We roll 2d6, and on a roll of 2 or 3, he dies and would be replaced by Harry Truman. The roll is a 9, so Roosevelt passes his health check. So we place Portal on the British discard pile and Walker, as well as Roosevelt, on the American discard pile. And we also place this US debate pass marker. That means that during the next American turn, the Americans can play a staff card to advance an issue, or they can pass and play would pass to the next player. Because Roosevelt's card was used, we place his block on the inactive band, and we also flip this marker to remind us that he is inactive for the remainder of the conference. So now it is the Soviets' turn, and the Soviets will go here for a bold move. They will play their Minister of Foreign Affairs, Vyacheslav Molotov. He has a strength of 5, but if played to advance a global issue, his strength is 6. Molotov's card is played, and the global issue marker is advanced to the number 6 box on the Soviet track, almost on Stalin's chair. The Americans have the option to debate the issue, but having played their leader's card, they decline to do so, and now the British must decide if they will debate the issue. The British will discard Sir Dudley Pound's card, his rating is only 1, for the purpose of using their leader, Sir Winston Churchill to debate the issue. Now, note that Churchill has an attribute that if his card is played on a global issue, the British gain one political alignment marker, but he also has health issues, and he'll have to roll after his card is played to see if he is inactive during the next conference or not. So by debating with Churchill, the global issue marker is moved 7 boxes, reaching the number 1 box on the British track. Because Churchill's card was played on a global issue, the British gain one political alignment marker, which we place for now near Churchill's chair. And now we have to roll for Churchill's health. 2d6. On a roll of 2 through 4, he suffers a heart attack and will not be active during the next conference. The roll is an 8 and he passes his health check. So we place Molotov on the Soviet discard pile, Pound and Churchill on the British discard pile, and because the British debated the issue, we place the British debate pass option marker on the British discard pile as a reminder that they can pass or advance an issue in their next turn. Because Churchill's card was played, we move his block to the inactive band and we flip the marker also. And he is inactive for the remainder of this conference. Play passes now to the Americans, but they decide to pass. And we remove the pass option marker from their discard pile. And now it's the British turn. And they also decide to pass. And now play passes to the Soviets. So the Soviets decide to discard the lowly Georgy Malenkov for the purpose of playing their leader, Joseph Stalin. And Stalin has various attributes. If he's played on a political military issue, the Soviets immediately receive one clandestine network marker. And if he's used to advance the atomic bomb research issue, he cannot be debated by another leader. He also has an effect that he may become paranoid. So we have to roll 2d6 after his card is used. And if he becomes paranoid, all the remaining staff members during this conference have their strength reduced by 1. So Stalin is played to advance the political military issue, and it will be moved 7 spaces to the number 5 box on the Soviet track. And neither the Americans nor the British will debate the issue. Because Stalin was played on a political military issue, the Soviets immediately receive one clandestine network marker. And we will place it for now next to Stalin's chair. And now we roll 2d6 to see if Stalin becomes paranoid. If he does, the strength of all remaining Soviet staff cards are reduced by 1 for this conference. The roll is a 6, so Stalin does not become paranoid in this conference. And we place Malenkov and Stalin in the Soviet discard pile. And Stalin's card having been played, he now becomes inactive, and we so mark it. So now it's the Americans' turn, and the Americans will play their Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau Jr. He has a strength of 4, but it increases to 5 if used to advance a global issue. And he will be used to advance the global issue, which is moved to the number 4 box on the US track. The British decide not to debate the issue. The Russians will do so. Soviets have 2 cards left. Their Chief of Staff Shukov and Nikolai Kuznetsov, the Chief of the Soviet Navy and People's Commissar. And Kuznetsov will be played to debate the issue. He has an attribute that if his card is played, we place a naval marker in the Arctic Theater box. So Kuznetsov is played, and strength is actually 5 because of the +1 for the Soviet national characteristic Niet. So the global marker is now moved to the number 1 space in the Soviet track. And we place a naval support marker in the Arctic theater. So Morgenthau goes into the American discard pile, Kuznetsov into the Soviet discard pile, and we place a pass marker on top of the Soviet discard pile. Now play passes to the British. The British have 3 cards left, and they will play the Deputy Prime Minister and Secretary of State, Clement Attlee. He has a strength of 5, but he has an attribute that decreases his strength by 2 if Churchill is still active, and that's because Attlee was the leader of the opposing Labour Party. Churchill was in the Conservative Party. And Churchill is inactive, so luckily for the British, Attlee's strength is 5. The play of Attlee's card moves the global issue to the number 4 box on the British track. The Russians have a chance to debate the issue, and they will do so. They have their last card, the Soviet Chief of Staff, Georgy Shukov, and notice that his rating is a star. That means that his strength is equal to 1 die roll. And of course, because he is debating an issue, we add 1 for the Niet National Soviet characteristic. So Shukov's card is played, and we roll 1d6. The roll is a 3 modified to a 4, so the global issue marker moves back to the center of the table. So Attlee goes to the British discard pile, as well as Shukov. And we place the marker, but it's not going to make a difference. The Soviets just ran out of cards for this conference. So it is now the Soviets' turn, but they have no cards to play, so we pass now to the Americans' turn. The Americans have 2 cards left, and they will play their special envoy, Averell Harriman. He has a strength of 4, unless he is advancing an issue on the Soviet track or Churchill is active. Churchill is inactive, but Harriman will be used to advance an issue which is currently on the Soviet track, the Soviet-directed offensive issue. So he has a strength of 5. So Harriman's card is played, and the issue is moved to the number 4 box of the US track. The British do not debate the issue, and the Soviets just can't. And Harriman goes to the discard pile. And now it's the British turn. With 2 cards left, the British will play the Minister of Labour and National Service, Ernest Bevin. He has an impressive strength of 5, but if used to advance a political military issue, the strength decreases by 1 to 4. And Bevin will be played to advance the 2/2 political military issue, so he has a strength of 4, and the issue is moved to the number 1 box on the Soviet track. The Russians, since they don't have any cards left, cannot debate the issue, and the Americans decline to do so. So Bevin goes to the discard pile. Now it's the Soviets' turn, but they don't have any cards. So now we move to the American turn. The Americans have 1 card left. Harry Hopkins, presidential advisor, strength of 5. His strength decreases significantly if Truman is president and if he is involved in a strategic material issue and Roosevelt is alive, then he can have a strength of 1 through 6 at the American player's option. But in this case, he will be played to advance the global issue 5 spaces to the number 5 box on the US track. The British only have 1 card left that wouldn't make any difference if it is used to debate the issue, and the Russians can't debate the issue because they have no cards. So into the discard pile, Harry Hopkins goes. And now to the last turn of this conference, the British turn. They have their last card, which is the card for Sir Stuart Menzies, alias C, Chief of the Secret Intelligence Service, with a whopping 1 rating, but if used to advance a political military issue, his rating would be 4. And the British could use Menzies' card to advance this political military issue into the number 3 box of their track. However, that would really throw a wrench into relations between the British and the Soviets, because if the British do that, the Soviets would win no issues in this conference. So the British will be very diplomatic about things. They will play Sir Stuart Menzies to move another issue, in which case his strength is only one, the US production issue, which is moved to the number 1 box on the British track. Since the other sides have no cards, the issue cannot be debated. And Menzies is placed in the British discard pile. Now we determine which side won the conference, and that is the side that won the most issues. An issue is won by a side if the issue is moved into that side's chair. An issue is also won by one side if at the end of the conference the issue is on that side's track. So we start with the British. They won the American production issue and the European theater leadership issue, that is 2 issues. The Soviets won the 2/2 political military issue, so they only have 1 issue. The Americans had advanced the 1/3 political military issue into Roosevelt's chair, so now we add the global issue and the Soviet directed offensive issue. So the Americans have 3 issues won. And because they have the most issues won, they are the conference winners. And that entails that they receive 3 victory points. And that's the end of the conference and the meeting segment. Now we go to the decision segment, and there are 7 activities here, and the order is the player, which is clockwise from the player that won the meeting segment. The conference was won by the Americans, so we begin each activity now with the British, followed by the Soviets, and then the Americans. The first activity is place directed offensive markers. And only the Americans won a directed offensive marker. And the Americans will place the Soviet directed offensive marker into the Manchuria box. Manchuria is the entry space for the Soviet Far East theater. The entry space is always the space which is next to be entered by the respective front marker, which is on each theater. Now, this directed offensive and an attack on Manchuria requires the Soviets to have declared war on Japan or the Emperor of Japan to have surrendered. Now we proceed to the next activity, which is to determine if any conditional issue applies. In this game, there are only 2 issues which are conditional issues, and one of those is the USSR declares war on Japan, and the other one is the second front issue, but in this particular scenario, this issue has already been considered to have been triggered. So conditional issues are different from regular issues in that they are triggered or they happen if they end the conference in the center of the table. Regular issues are won by each of the sides by moving them into their chairs or their tracks at the end of the conference, but conditional issues, if the conference ends and they are at the center of the table, they are in effect, and therefore, in this case, the USSR declares war on Japan. And as we stated before, that was a precondition for the Soviets to be able to attack and move into Manchuria. So now that directed offensive that was placed will take effect. When a conditional issue is advanced or debated and it enters the center of the table space, the player advancing or debating the issue may choose to end its movement there instead of moving the issue the full number of spaces. So in this example, if we play Francis Perkins, who has a strength of 4 for a conditional issue, instead of moving the full 4, which would land the second front marker, which is a conditional issue in the number 1 box of the US track, the American player has the option of stopping the movement of the conditional issue once it reaches the center of the table. The next activity now is production, where each player determines how many production counters they have to allocate. The British started the turn with 4 production markers, 3 which you see next to Churchill's chair, and 1 which we placed earlier in the China-Burma-India theater box as a result of the British instruction of the conference card, which mandates that we convert 1 British production to an offensive support marker in that theater. The British won a US production marker. That means that they take 1 production marker from the Americans. So the British have 4 production, plus the 1 in the China-Burma-India theater, and also the European theater leadership issue, which allows them to convert it into 2 support markers. The British will convert all their production markers, including the 1 they gained from the Americans, into offensive support markers, and they are converted on a 1-to-1 basis. And the European theater leadership issue is also converted into 2 offensive support markers. And they also convert the British production that is allocated to the China-Burma-India theater into an offensive support marker, and we will place it in the entry space for that theater, which is the one directly in front to the front marker, which is the Burma space. So now we place the 6 offensive support markers left. 5 support markers are placed in the entry space for the Western theater, which is West Germany, and they will be used in the military segment to try to help that front advance into the attacked space. And the remaining offensive support marker will be placed in the entry space for the Mediterranean theater, which is northern Italy. Now it's the Soviets' turn to allocate their production. They only have 3 production markers, and Stalin is not very happy because of that. And Roosevelt proposes to provide to Stalin 2 support markers if Stalin forgoes his 2/2 political military issue. That is, he forgoes converting it into 2 political alignment and clandestine network markers. And this is a type of negotiation that can occur during this game, and all these types of deals are not binding on the parties. So Stalin decides to accept the American offer, and he will forego converting his political military issue marker, and he, of course, is counting on the Americans in their turn to allocate 2 support markers to the Soviet Eastern Front. And the Soviets convert their 3 production markers into offensive support markers. The Soviet-directed offensive marker forces them to place 2 offensive support markers in Manchuria. And the Soviets placed their last offensive support marker in East Germany. Of course, they are counting on the American promise of placing 2 of their offensive support markers there. Now it's the Americans' turn to allocate production. In addition to converting a production marker into an offensive support or naval support marker, 1 production marker can be used to convert a political military issue marker. Now, the Americans will use this production marker to convert this 1/3 political military issue marker. So the Americans will receive 1 political alignment and 3 clandestine network markers. And these markers will be placed during the war phase on the military display. And they will convert each of their remaining production markers into offensive support markers. The Americans, because they have command of the European theater and the Pacific theater, receive 1 support marker for each, which has to be placed in that respective theater. So for the European theater, there will be an offensive support marker, and the Pacific theater, a naval support marker. So the Americans placed 2 of their 5 offensive support markers in the entry space of the Western Theater, which is West Germany. They place an offensive support marker in the entry space for the Southwest Pacific Theater, the Philippines, and a naval support marker also to support the offensive in that theater. Having 2 offensive support markers left, one is placed in the entry space of the Central Pacific Theater. And the Americans placed their last offensive support marker in East Germany. If you remember, the Americans had promised the Soviets 2 offensive support markers in exchange for the Soviets forfeiting their 2/2 political military issue marker. And this is the kind of fate that can occur to deals of this sort. In this game, these type of deals are not enforceable. So this is the end of the war, and each of the sides are looking more at how the world is going to be configured and less about honoring their commitments. The next activity is theater leadership. And if you recall, the British won the European theater leadership issue, and they gained 2 support markers for that. Now they decide if they want to be the leaders of the European theater or they'll give it to the Americans. And the British decide to take command of the European theater, and we mark it accordingly. The next activity is atomic bomb research. There is an A-bomb research issue, which in this particular conference was not selected, and therefore this activity would be skipped now. But let's take a look at the A-bomb research track. This is the atomic bomb research track, and at the beginning of this scenario, the Soviet Manhattan spiring marker starts here in the letter to Roosevelt space, and the Americans have a lead. They start here in the Hanford space. If any of the sides win the atomic bomb research issue, we roll 1d6 for the Americans, and on a 4 through 6, the American marker is advanced 1 space. Now, if the Soviets win the atomic bomb research issue, in addition to making the die roll for the American marker, the Soviet Manhattan spiring marker advances automatically to the next space. Now, production markers can be used to serve as a +1 die roll modifier for the American die roll. And at the end of the game, depending on the position where the markers ended, there's a number of victory points that can be awarded to each of the sides. Now, if the American marker ends in the Trinity atomic bomb space, it has complied with one of the 3 conditions for Japanese surrender. The other 2 are that Germany has surrendered in the same conference as when this happened or before, and that the Soviet Far East Front is in or beyond the Manchuria space. Now, as stated before, in this particular playthrough or example, none of the sides took a hold of the atomic bomb research issue, so there is no action in the atomic bomb research track in this particular instance. And now we go to the last activity of the decision segment, the global issue activity. And global issues are issues that each of the sides have that pertain to the shaping of the world after the war. The United States has 2 global issues: United Nations, self-determination. The British have 2, colonialism and free Europe, and also the Soviets have 2, spheres of influence and communist cadres. And as you can see, each global issue of one side has an impact on the triggering of a global issue of the other side. So the United States will have a global issue to fight out, metaphorically, of course, with Britain, and another one to be faced off against Russia, and Britain and Russia have the same situation. Now, in this particular case, the United States won the global issue, and they will select which of their 2 global issues they will place into effect. After a global issue marker is placed in one position, it never returns to the neutral position. In this particular case, the Americans will select the self-determination global issue. Let's say that during the next turn, the British win the global issue. They could select this marker and put Free Europe into effect, or they can move this marker, which never returns to the neutral position, all the way to select the global issue of colonialism. But for now, the Americans select self-determination, and let's see what effect that has on the game. Global issues affect the placement of political alignment markers and clandestine networks. While the marker was in the neutral position, no political alignment markers could be placed on colony spaces, but there was no restriction on clandestine network placement. But now that the Americans have selected self-determination, all players can place any available political alignment markers in colonies without any restriction. So now we go to the war phase. There are three segments here: the clandestine network segment, the political alignment segment, and the military segment. We start with the clandestine network segment. At the beginning of this segment, each side receives one clandestine network marker for each of their intelligence agencies. The United States receives one for the OSS, the British one for the MI6, and the Russians one for their NKVD. In this phase, each of the sides places its clandestine networks in the countries in the military display. Now, the side that goes first is the side that has the most clandestine network markers, and that's the United States, that has 4. The United States places a clandestine network marker in Denmark and another one in Malaya. The Americans have 2 more clandestine network markers to be placed. They use the next one to eliminate the Soviet clandestine network in Austria, and their last network marker to be placed right there in Austria. Now it's the Soviets' turn to place their clandestine networks. The Soviets used their first clandestine network marker to eliminate the American clandestine network in Austria, and the second one to be placed also there. The British only have one clandestine network marker to place, and they use it to eliminate the American clandestine network in Malaya. Now we go to the political alignment segment, and starting with the side that has the most political alignment markers, that side places them first. However, the Americans have one, as well as the British. The Russians have none to place, and because the Americans have the arsenal of democracy and national characteristic, which they decide tiebreakers, they decide to let the British place their political alignment marker first. A political alignment marker can only be placed in a country where a side has at least one clandestine network, or it can be used to eliminate a political alignment marker of an opponent that is already placed in a country. And before placing the political alignment marker, we note that the marker is in the neutral position with respect to Free Europe and spheres of influence. That means that no political alignment marker placement in countries connected to the Western or Eastern Front tracks is allowed. There's no restriction on clandestine network placement. So the British cannot place political alignment markers in any country along the Western Front nor the Eastern Front, even though they have clandestine networks in Greece and in Poland. Note that on the Mediterranean front there is no such restriction, but the British have a problem. They already have political alignment markers in the Middle East and Persia, and the maximum number of political alignment markers in a space is 1. In the Pacific theater, there are no British clandestine network markers in any colony, so the political alignment marker cannot be placed in any space there. Therefore, there is nowhere to place a political alignment marker, and it is lost. Now the Americans place their political alignment marker. The Americans also cannot place their political alignment marker in any country along the western or the eastern front. The Americans cannot use their political alignment marker to eliminate one of the British political alignment markers in that theater because the Americans have no clandestine networks in any of the countries along the Mediterranean theater. So the Americans decide to place their political alignment marker in the colony of Vietnam, where they already have a clandestine network. And now we proceed to the last segment of the war phase. This is the military segment. It is composed of two activities: Axis reserve placement and front advancement. In the Axis reserve placement activity, we follow a series of rules to see where these reserve units will be placed. The map has a summary of these rules that pertain to each of the theaters, to the European theater, as well as to the Pacific. Let's begin with the European theater. If any front is attempting to enter Germany, two German armies have to stay in Germany. None of the fronts are attempting to enter Germany. They're not adjacent to the Germany space, so that rule doesn't apply. We place a German army in the Soviet Eastern entry space. The next rule that applies is if the Normandy space has been previously entered, we place two German armies in the entry space of the front which is closer to Germany. But if we have two that are equidistant, like we have here, we place one in the entry space of each. And now the remaining three armies are randomly distributed between the three front tracks. We roll a six-sided die, 1 or 2, it'll go to the western front, 3 or 4 to the eastern front, 5 to the Mediterranean, and 6 to the Arctic. And if there is a naval marker in the Arctic front, we remove a naval marker. Otherwise, we treat the 6 as a 5 and place the army in the Mediterranean entry space. So we roll for the first German army. The roll is a 4, so it goes to the eastern front. Now we roll for the second German army. The roll is a 5, so it is placed in northern Italy. And now we roll for the last German reserve army. The roll is a 2, so it is placed in the western front entry space. And the Japanese reserve armies, we've already allocated one to the Philippines as a result of the instruction mandated here for Leyte Gulf, where we had to place a Japanese reserve in the Southwest Pacific Theater, and the Philippines is the entry space in the Southwest Pacific. We also, according to the same instruction, allocated one Imperial Japanese Navy reserve to the Southwest Pacific Theater, and we place it right next to our naval support markers. Now we place the reserve Japanese armies according to the rules of placement here. The first one is if any front is attempting to enter Japan, all Japanese armies are placed in Japan, but no front is adjacent to the Japan space, so we skip that rule. If the USSR front has exited the Far East theater box, we place two Japanese armies in the Far East front's entry space. And the Russian front is at Nomonhan, so it has exited the Far East theater initial box. So two Japanese armies are placed in Manchuria. Next, if any front is attempting to enter a B-29 space, we place a Japanese army in each of these locations. First, if there are multiple such spaces, we start Central Pacific, Southwest Pacific, and finally China, Burma, India. There is a front attempting to enter into Iwo Jima, which is a B-29 space, so the last Japanese reserve army goes there. Now we place one Imperial Japanese Navy reserve, and we saw that the conference card called for an Imperial Japanese Navy reserve to be placed in the Southwest Pacific Theater, so we placed it there. So the next step is to resolve the Battle of Leyte Gulf. We eliminate one U.S. naval support marker on account of the Japanese Navy Reserve, and now we have to roll 1d6 to see if that Japanese reserve unit is eliminated permanently from the game or it returns to Japan. On a 1 through 4, it is permanently eliminated, so we roll 1d6. The roll is a 2, so we remove the Japanese Navy Reserve unit permanently from the game. Note that there are 2 Imperial Japanese Navy units in the game, but only one can be used at a time. So the Japanese still have this one for the next turn. And now we proceed with the front advancement activity of the military segment. And here, each front has to attempt to advance into its respective entry space. A front will advance if it rolls a 1d10, which is equal or less than its modified strength. A front's base strength is 2, and we add 2 for each offensive support marker. So here we see 2 for the Russian front plus 2 offensive support markers, and its strength is currently at 6, but a front's strength is weakened by 2 for each enemy reserve army. There are 3 there, so it would be a -6. So 6 minus 6 is 0. And if the modified strength is 0 or less, a die roll is not even necessary. And in this particular case, the Soviets failed to enter and advance into East Germany. Now here the Allies on the Western Front will attempt to advance into West Germany. We start with a base strength of 2. There are 7 offensive support markers. That's a plus 14. For 16, we subtract 4 for the German reserve armies. The total modified strength of our army is 12. Because the front's modified strength is 10 or greater, in this case 12, the advance will be automatic. Now, we have to check to see if there's a breakthrough. A breakthrough is an advance of 2 spaces, and if that happens, the Allies would move into Germany and cause the surrender of Germany. For a breakthrough to occur, we have to roll a die, and on a modified roll of 10 or higher, it occurs, and we add +1 for each point of a front's modified strength, which is greater than 10. The front's strength is 12, so we would add 2 to the die roll. So we roll 1d10 and add 2. On a result of 10 or higher, the Allies move into Germany. The roll is a 3 modified to a 5, so the breakthrough does not occur. But the British and Americans move into West Germany and they gain 5 victory points each. Also, we remove permanently 1 German reserve unit. Now we go to resolve the possible advance into northern Italy. Base strength of 2, we add 2 for the offensive support marker, that's 4, minus 2 for the German reserves, a total of 2. So the Allies need 1 or 2 on a 10-sided die. We roll 1d10. The roll is a 5, and the advance on northern Italy fails. Now to the Pacific theater. Let's start with the Southwest Pacific. The advance can be attempted because there are 3 naval support markers in the Southwest Pacific theater. So we can attempt the advance. We have a base strength of 2, plus 2 for offensive support is 4, minus 2 for the Japanese Army Reserve, it is 2. So we roll 1d10, and the result is a 3, and the Allies fail to advance into the Philippines. Now to the Central Pacific Theater, there are also 3 naval support markers, so the Allies can attempt the amphibious attack here on Iwo Jima. 2 plus 2 for the offensive support is 4, minus 2 for the Japanese reserve, also 2 or less needed to advance. And the result is a 2, and the Allies successfully advance into Iwo Jima, and the Americans earn 2 victory points. Now the Soviets will attempt to advance into Manchuria. They have a base strength of 2 for the front, 2 offensive support markers, which increases their strength to 6, -4 for the reserve Japanese armies, for a total modified strength of 2. So they need a 1 or a 2. So we roll 1d10. But the result is a 4. So the Soviets fail to advance into Manchuria. The Japanese armies are returned to Japan, and we eliminate the support markers. Now we move on to the China-Burma-India theater, and the front is in the starting box, and there is 1 offensive support marker. So there's a base strength of 2 plus 2 for the offensive support marker is 4. So a roll of 1 through 4 is needed to advance. So we roll 1d10, and the roll is a 3. So the front advances successfully into Burma. And that's the end of the front advancement step, and the end of the military segment and the war phase. And now we pass to the post-mortem phase. In the post-mortem phase, if both Germany and Japan have surrendered, the game ends and we determine the winner. And if this is the conclusion of the 10th conference, or the last turn of any scenario, we also determine the winner. And if both Axis countries have not surrendered, and this is not the 10th conference, we begin the next conference. Victory points are scored at the end of the game. There's a victory point track which can be used to tally victory points during the game, but the score that counts is the one determined at the end of the game. Victory points are awarded for the following reasons. Each player receives 3 victory points for each country where the player has a political alignment marker. Each player receives 1 victory point for each country space with at least 1 clandestine network and no political alignment marker. Each player receives 5 victory points for each global issue on the player's advantage position. The United States receives 3 victory points for each conference won, as well as the British. For each conference they win, they receive 3 victory points. The Soviets, however, receive 5 victory points for each conference they win. As to colonies, 2 victory points are awarded to the British for each colony with no clandestine network or political alignment markers. 8 victory points are awarded per Axis surrendered country to each of the major powers if they have a front in that Axis country. And in the case of US and British fronts, each side there receives 8 victory points. In this particular example, the China-Burma-India Theater Front and Southwest Pacific Theater Fronts have entered the space of Japan, causing its surrender. Thus, the US receives 8 victory points as well as the British. They do not receive any extra victory points because a second of their fronts entered Japan. Note that the Soviets did not reach Japan, but they receive 8 victory points for reaching the Korea space. And as to the Central Pacific Theater, the United States receives 2 victory points for reaching the Iwo Jima space. Victory points are also awarded in connection with the atomic bomb track. If the blue US marker reaches the Trinity A-bomb space, the United States receives 3 victory points as well as United Kingdom. At the end of the game, the Soviets received 3 victory points for each space achieved by the Manhattan Spy Ring marker. In this example, the marker advanced 2 spaces to the Hanford space, so the Soviets would receive 6 victory points. And if the US research marker does not reach the Trinity A-bomb space at the end of the game, the Soviets receive 3 victory points. This concludes this video presentation of Churchill's extended example play. This video covered one full conference, and as you can see, a lot happens in one conference, including things not shown here. Each of the sides has its own characteristics, strengths, and weaknesses. In sum, this is a highly innovative and replayable game. The conference system is a brilliant and exciting mechanic which could be implemented to simulate other pivotal historical situations, events which are seldom recreated in gaming, such as the Treaty of Versailles or the Congress of Vienna. Whoever thought that a game about meetings around a table between competing allies could be so entertaining? I hope this video gives you an idea of the flow of the game and what the game has to offer. This is Stuka Joe signing off for now. Thanks for watching.